In this video, we're answering the question everyone's asking: what does it take to get your private pilot's license? All the requirements coming up. Carl with the Aviation Guys here, where we're helping you go further in aviation. And if you like training tips, going on flights, and just things about aviation, then this channel's for you. So please, if you like what you see, consider subscribing. Now let's get going. Alright, a quick disclaimer before we actually get started to the video. As I'm going through the requirements, things are going to seem really daunting, but don't worry. As you start going through it and doing your pilot training, things are going to get easier and easier. But to help you track where you're at with your training, I've created a little document you can find inside of the description below that'll help you figure out where you're at and where you're going. Now, let's get started. Alright, to get your private pilot's license, there's two basic requirements you have to start with. The first is an age limit. You can start logging hours whenever you want. There's no age limit as to when you can start learning to fly. But in order to get your student pilot certificate, you have to be at least 16 years of age. And then to get your private pilot license, you have to be of at least 17 years of age. So if you've got that covered, we can move on to part 2, which is being proficient in English. English is the international language of flying. If you don't know it, you can't communicate with air traffic control, and you may not be able to communicate with other people flying inside of the area. So make sure that you're proficient in English. Now, if you have those two requirements buttoned up, then you can move on to your pilot training. So in all, you're going to need 40 hours of flight time to be able to get your private pilot's license. And from here on out, we're going to break this down into 4 major parts: dual flight time, solo flight time, ground school, and testing. Okay, dual flight time. This is what most of us think about when we think about flight training, having your instructor sitting there in the airplane with you. You're going to need 20 hours of it, but the FAA says you're going to need 4 things to come from it. First, 3 hours of cross-country flight training in a single-engine airplane. Second, 3 hours of night flight training in a single-engine airplane that includes at least 1 cross-country flight over 100 nautical miles total distance, and 10 takeoff and 10 landings to a full stop, with each involving a flight in the traffic pattern at an airport. Third, 3 hours of flight training by reference to instruments in a single-engine airplane. And fourth, 3 hours of flight training in a single-engine airplane within 60 days prior to the practical test. That's not all though. Coupled with these, you're going to have to learn some other things to go along with it. Excuse me while I read them. Pre-flight preparations, pre-flight procedures, airport and sea-based operations, takeoffs, landings and go-around, performance maneuvers, ground reference maneuvers, navigation, slow flight and stalls, basic instrument maneuvers, emergency operation, night operations, and post-flight procedures. Whew. Now that may sound overwhelming, but as you start your training, it's going to get a lot easier, and it won't be nearly as overwhelming as it sounds. So now, where does all this dual time bring you to? Part 2 of your flight training, solo time. So everything you learned in your dual flight training time really was to prepare you for solo time, and all the maneuvers and things that you learned are things that you have to know before you can solo. So much so that it's required by your instructor to give you a test to make sure that you know it. And after that, he also has to make sure you have 2 other things: a student pilot certificate and a medical exam by an FAA medical examiner. Now, the student pilot certificate is just like a driver's permit, and under the instruction of your instructor, you can go flying by yourself. And the medical exam is just to make sure you're healthy enough to be able to fly on your own. Now, you're going to need 10 hours of solo time, and the FAA says that it has to include 5 hours of solo cross-country flying, 1 solo cross-country flight of at least 150 nautical miles total distance with full stop landings at 3 points, and 1 segment of at least 50 nautical miles between takeoffs and landings, and 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop at an airport with an operating control tower. Okay, it's time for some math. 20 hours of dual flight time plus 10 hours of solo time only equals 30, and we need 40 hours to get our private pilot's license. Well, it should be no shocker that all those requirements are going to take you more than 20 hours to be able to get. And in fact, most people don't get their private pilot's license to around 65 hours. It takes that long to make sure that we're proficient inside of our flying and that we're flying safely. All right, it's time to move on to our 3rd part of our private pilot certificate, ground school. Now, if you thought that learning to fly was all about flying the airplane, you would be wrong. Most of the learning that you need to do happens on the ground in ground school. Here you're going to learn about everything from aerodynamics to weather. And you can take your ground school from your flight instructor, a local course, or even online. But you need to get a certificate of completion in order to move on to the next step of your flight training. Part 4, testing. There are actually 3 tests that you have to take in order to get your private pilot's license. The first one is the written. The written test goes over everything that you've learned up into the air and down on the ground, so make sure that you prepare for it. And you have to take it at a certified testing center. A lot of flight schools in your area may have a testing center that you can do it at, or know of one that you can take out locally in your community. Okay, your second test is your oral test. It's going to be a lot like your written test, but more in a discussion format to not only see if you know the right answer, but how you got to that answer. It's going to be administered by the same person who's going to give you your final test, which is the Checkride. The Checkride is a lot like a driver's test. It's less about book smarts and more about making sure that you can fly the plane safely. You'll have to execute all the maneuvers and everything that you learned inside of your dual flight time, so just make sure you're proficient at your flying and ready to go. Now, if you have all this under control and you pass that Checkride, then you have become a private pilot. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, make sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Also, tell us what you think inside of the comments down below. As always, share aviation wherever you can, and we'll see you in the next one.